My name is Morgan Hartley, and today I'm going to talk to you about my trait-based theoretical literature review investigating migratory behaviours of benthic organisms from the Wadden Sea. The Wadden Sea is situated in the southeast of the North Sea and spans the coast of the Netherlands, Germany and Denmark. The Wadden Sea hosts one of the world's largest intertidal flat systems, spanning over 10,000 kilometres squared. And due to the diversity of both flora and fauna that the Wadden Sea supports, it's actually a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So the focus of my literature review is going to be the benthic communities within the Wadden Sea. The Wadden Sea supports both microphytobenthos communities, which are microscopic algal communities containing cyanobacteria, diatoms, euglenids, and dinoflagellates, and also macrozoobenthic communities. The macrozoobenthic communities are invertebrates which live in association or on the surface of the sediment and can be retained on a 1 millimetre sieve. My literature review was done from a trait-based perspective, which means grouping species by morphological, physiological, or life history traits, allowing us to simplify the ecological interpretations of these locations. So both microphytobenthos and macrozoobenthos are largely hidden from the naked eye. Microphytobenthos are obviously really small, and then the macrozoobenthos generally live within the sediment. But despite this, these communities are highly active and demonstrate daily migratory behaviours. These migratory behaviours can have really important ecological implications, such as biogeochemical cycling implications through the sediment turnover, and also the facilitation of species interaction through these behaviours as well, which can allow for potential predator-prey interactions. So this brings me on to the rationale of my project. Migratory behaviours are quite often studied from a taxonomic perspective or species-specific perspective, and trait-based perspectives have rarely been used, and especially within the Wadden Sea communities, as you can see here from this search, there's not very many studies at all. So the aim of my literature review was to describe, classify and critically review the short-term migratory behaviours of both microphytobenthos and macrozoobenthos from a trait-based perspective. So this brings me on to my hypotheses. For the microphytobenthos communities, I hypothesise that these migratory behaviours will differ between individuals of different mobility traits and resource acquisition traits. So for the resource acquisition traits, this was the acquisition of light and nutrients. So to encompass the taxonomic diversity of microphytobenthos, accessory photosynthetic pigments and the ability to nitrogen fix was used. And for the macrozoobenthos, I hypothesised that migratory behaviours will differ between different trait groups, mobility trait groups and feeding trait groups. So to collect all of this information, I used obviously Google Scholar and Web of Science. I used Mendeley to consolidate and keep all of my many references. I actually used Microsoft Access, which is a relational database software, which allowed me to consolidate all of my information regarding species traits. I utilised Biotic, which is a biological traits catalogue for Macrozoobenthos to give me an idea of different species traits. And then I also utilised a site called Connected Papers, which allows you to input a scientific paper and it will give you a mind map like this of other papers which are relevant or within a similar topic. So to kind of direct my literature review, I firstly started by trying to investigate the species presence and distribution, as unfortunately I didn't get to go to the Wadden Sea, so I firstly wanted to make sure I had a proper overview in my head of what the study site was like. I then classified these species traits into the mobility and resource acquisition traits that I mentioned. I then spent a long time searching through the literature and trying to describe the migratory behaviours to then link these back to the species trait groups. So this brings me on to the first part of my results. For my results, I'm going to present a small subsection of what I found, just because if I was going to go through everything, it might take quite a long time. And I'm going to do kind of a blended version of my results and discussion and kind of give you an overview of what I thought was really interesting. So firstly, I classified microphytobenthos by their mobility traits into either mobile, creeping, or immobile. Mobile and immobile is relatively self-explanatory, but creeping is a bit interesting in the sense that these species can move, but they are microphytobenthic species which live on the surface of individual sediment grains, so they can move around the surface of the grain that they're adhered to, but they usually can't move within the interstitial spaces. So here I'm going to give you an overview of some of the mobile microphytobenthic species that you can find within the Wadden Sea. And as you can see, these really span all of the taxonomic groups within the microphytobenthos, but they all share the ability to be mobile. So the fact that they're mobile, does this mean that they possess a migratory behaviour? Yes. These species all demonstrate a very characteristic migratory behaviour, whereas in creeping and immobile species, I couldn't find any evidence to suggest that these species would possess any migratory behaviour. So all of these species demonstrate a characteristic behaviour in the sense that they will migrate from the lower levels of the sediment up to the sediment surface at low tide during the day. They will remain at the sediment surface throughout the day, and then as the tide comes back in or as night falls, they will migrate back down into the sediment. So these species also share a mobility trait group, and they also share migratory behaviour. I then wanted to see if this migratory behaviour could potentially be linked to resource acquisition traits. It's been shown that species-specific behaviours within this characteristic migratory behaviour, so for example, species will migrate to the surface at slightly different times during the day, depending on the ideal light conditions. So here I have classified the accessory photosynthetic pigmentation on the left-hand side, and I have classified whether or not these species can carry out nitrogen fixation. However, I couldn't find any evidence that would directly link these resource acquisition traits to differences in migratory behaviour, because, for example, different epipelic diatoms possess different timings in their migratory behaviour despite sharing accessory photosynthetic pigments. So I think examining these migrations on a resource acquisition trait base, you almost need to go into even more detail, potentially biochemical detail, to fully understand how these differences are occurring. So I wanted to explore the motivations for this behaviour. So due to the photosynthetic nature and timing of microphytobenthic migration, it's likely that light is a motivating factor. The migratory ability of these species really allows them to maximize their photosynthetic potential and also prevent photoinhibition through the process of phototaxis, which is the migration towards ideal light conditions and away from unideal light conditions. So it's been shown that the creeping and immobile species actually possess physiological adaptations to cope and prevent photoinhibition, whilst these migratory species can just move to an ideal location. So I then wanted to explore if these mobile species can migrate to the sediment surface for ideal light conditions, what is the motivation for going back down into the sediment? So it's been shown that aspects such as prey avoidance and physical disturbance may be motivation for this downward migration. But it's also been shown that the presence of a subsurface nutrient reservoir can actually encourage both species of diatoms and euglenids to migrate further down into the sediment. So it's likely that access to nutrients is really driving and really motivating them to go back down into the sediment. And I feel like these two aspects can be really nicely tied together in this phenomenon, which is called micromigration, which has been identified in diatom species, where while they're at the sediment surface, they will carry out a very shallow migratory behaviour to maximise their light and nutrient access. And they will rotate, the individuals will rotate amongst each other, kind of alternating who's at the surface and who's slightly lower in the sediment. So this brings me on to the macrozoobenthos portion of my results. I wanted to really briefly kind of demonstrate, here are 3 really common macrozoobenthic species from within the Wadden Sea. And these 3 species really come from very different mobility trait groups and feeding trait groups. But despite this difference, they all display some form of migratory behaviour. In all cases, this migratory behaviour is actually correlated with high tide and only occurs at night, apart from in the case of Carcinus manus, this crab species, which will carry out this migratory behaviour both at night and during the day. I wanted to explore whether these migratory behaviours could be linked to feeding traits, but actually it's really interesting because it doesn't really seem like this is the case. Crothium voltator can feed from within its burrow, but during the night it will migrate into the overlying water, potentially to find preferential environmental conditions. Strassoderma ojule is really interesting because this bivalve species will migrate to the sediment surface at night, which doesn't seem to make sense for a suspension feeder because usually it should be able to fill its energy requirements from its burrow within the sediment. But it has been suggested that this behaviour is actually linked to the presence of a parasite. In the case of Carcinus manus, this species, it does seem that its migratory behaviour is directly linked to prey access as it follows the tide up as the tide comes in, and will also follow the tide as it retreats. And it's been shown that the presence of baited traps will actually encourage more individuals of this species to follow the tide. So just kind of to conclude what I found, migratory behaviours are clearly very common and prevalent, more so than I even expected, both within the microphytobenthos and macrozoobenthos. These migratory patterns are really variable and span different trait groups. And clearly tidal and solar cycles are very important within these intertidal migrations, as they usually are one of the primary triggers. So to consider my hypotheses, migratory behaviours in both microphytobenthos and macrozoobenthos can be attributed to their mobility traits, but attributing these behaviours to their either resource acquisition traits or feeding traits actually becomes a little bit more complicated and they can't be directly linked. So just to briefly discuss some future considerations for the project. I'm currently in the stage of writing my discussion, so there's more directions I want to go, but I think there's a lot more exploration that can be done. It's quite a time-consuming process characterising all of these different things, and I think it would be really nice to potentially consider other trait groups or potentially explore seasonality and temporal differences. I also hope that I can explore some ecological implications of these behaviours. One aspect I want to explore is potentially how eutrophication may affect the migratory behaviours of these species and then subsequently affect higher trophic levels such as birds or fish. And as you can see, the Wadden Sea supports a lot of migratory birds, you can see in this image. And then also as well, doing a trait-based analysis for microphytobenthos can actually be quite complicated due to the taxonomic diversity. So I think development of a database that encompasses all of the microphytobenthos groups would also be a really something that's worth considering for the future. Thank you very much for listening. Anyone has any questions?